Hi, good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are in the world, and welcome to the ZP webinar on wearable technologies, specifically from ZP, but we'll probably illustrate it with examples from elsewhere. It's probably worth saying that this is not one of those webinars where there'll be there will be lots of talk, but it won't just be talk. I've got some live demos in front of me. So you will see energy drinks and blood all shared and used this afternoon. With that said, I'll jump forward with the main presentation, or at least a couple of slides just to kind of get us kicked off. Okay, so this is a webinar about technologies around wearables. I'll make that a bit more specific in a bit, but we'll talk about trends in the market. And I think, you probably, through attending today, you'll probably already understand these trends. But why is ZP in particular here? And we'll talk about the definite pros of electrochemistry as a technology, either for point of care diagnostics or also for wearable sensors. So I'll contrast the glucose strip with the CGM, continuous glucose monitor. This is the Abbott Freestyle Libre 2. I'll say I contrast them. They've actually fundamentally got the same science. They're both electrochemical, enzyme-based amperometric sensors. I'll talk about the technology stack that we have at Zimmer and Peacock, which I would really describe as kind of sample to cloud, and I'll do you a sample to cloud demo of what that really means. I will talk about configurations. I'll sort of pop in and out of configurations. So by configurations, I mean transdermal sensors, which are the kind of wire type sensors that Medtronic, Dexcom, and Abbott have. And I know there's a lot of Chinese vendors, or vendors rather in China, that are bringing these kind of sensors also onto the market. Though I also know there's a lot of IP controversy at the moment as well, because some of them bear uncanny similarity to incumbent technologies already on the market. I'll talk about microneedles. So I have an example of some microneedles this afternoon. And I'll talk about kind of PK Vitality, which is a company that was developing microneedles for about 5 years, and where that IP rests now. I'll also talk about sweat analysis. I'll show you some sweat patches in place on people. And I'll also talk about implanted sensors, and I'll show you a couple of examples from ZP about implanted sensors. So there'll be quite a lot of content. I'll show you some of our experiences as well, and then I'll do a summary. So when I say why are we here, I mean ZP is fundamentally, we're a contract developer, contract manufacturer, ISO 13485 of electrochemical biosensors, and some of us started our careers making glucose strips. For example, I mean, when I say some of us, I'm one of those. That was my first kind of role out after university, was making glucose strips. And then I spent quite a long time in California working on CGMs, continuous glucose monitoring there. Not on this particular one, because that's the Abbott Freestyle Libre 2, though I actually did work for Abbott at one point in my career. But I have worked on CGMs and some of the leading CGMs on the market today. I'll just stop that for a second and just kind of swap a little bit of a camera. I just want to make the point about, I'm sure you're not in doubt as to why electrochemistry is the winning technology when it comes to either point of care diagnostics or wearables. But, I mean, electrochemistry teaches us some things. It teaches us, if I want a low cost, low power set of electronics for measuring something, then electrochemistry kind of proves itself in that way. It also proves itself in the way that, in fact, when I take a sample like this, there's no sample preparation for it. So many sensing modalities really require a lot of sample preparation. But electrochemistry, I can put a drop of blood on a device like this, and after 5 seconds, I can actually get a result. In this particular case, my blood glucose is 121 milligrams per DL. The average is 90. Hopefully, it's just still the remnants of my lunch. But the reason I bring that up is because as a science, electrochemistry has really kind of proven itself to be scalable, to be low cost. Obviously, when I say scalable manufacturing, and it's exactly the same science then that gets played out in these glucose, or these CGMs, these continuous glucose monitors that you now see people wearing. I mean, the thing that's kind of keeping this at the size that it's at is, in the end, is actually the battery. So it's the power supply or the power source that's actually starting to limit the shrinkage down a little bit. But I'll sort of change back to the slides. But I just want to kind of say that, at ZP, everything we do is around electrochemistry, and I think we're a little bit different because we have a deep fundamental understanding of electrochemistry. But I wouldn't want to actually make you then think that we didn't know how to actually manufacture. So, we do manufacture electrodes at scale, and I'll show you all sorts of form factors this afternoon, and how we can actually make biosensors. So we're here because of electrochemistry, and we're here because diabetes, it's obviously a chronic disease, global chronic disease, and it's really driven the need for biosensors. In the end, electrochemistry went out. Most biosensors actually started off, or glucose strips, or glucose acids started off as optical, but actually it was electrochemistry essentially went out because of its merits, not because anyone particularly loved electrochemistry. And then it's been translated now into wearable biosensors. So at ZP, we tend to work on CGM, continuous glucose monitoring, lactate ketones, sodium, potassium, chloride. These are the kind of analytes that people are interested in converting into wearables. And we're part of a movement that's been going on. I would almost say that the start of this was in the 80s with things like the iStat, but this idea of decentralization of laboratory test. We have clinical analyzer. There was something called the Abaxis, where Abaxis came up with a sort of desktop system for doing multiple analytes. The Epoch from EpoCal, doing blood analytes. We got the shrinkage down to, I think this is the Johnson and Johnson. I want to say LifeScan technology for glucose monitoring. Then we're starting to get into the era of CGM, continuous glucose monitoring. And now I've even had to update this slide. We've reached the era of implantation. Senseonics is leading this, at least in terms of market, in terms of technology readiness. And they've, at this point, I think maybe they've got 12 months acceptance. The FDA may have cleared them to be 12 months in situ. Now, Senseonics does have problems, but they have put a long-term implantable glucose sensor on the market. But that particular image, just out of interest, is a ZP technology. So at ZP, we're also experienced in long-term implantables as well. But the direction has been shrinking it down, desktop, handheld, palm size, wearable, and now actually implantable as well. And I suspect that from a decade from now, there'll be a couple of players on the market with a long-term implantable sensor. Now at ZP, we have a couple of platforms. We have a point-of-care diagnostics platform, and we also have a platform for doing wearables as well. So everything at ZP, we want to go from idea to something quite tangible, or something tangible really quickly. So rather than sort of starting on the whiteboard every time, we've actually got quite a lot of the pieces already in place, and it certainly accelerates idea to tangible. If I say MVP, minimally viable product, especially as some of you are in California, that may suggest a product, but it is actually quite hard to have product in medical and wearable applications. So I would say MVP, minimally viable prototype. So I'm going to slightly change that P, but the desire to get to MVP does exist, and ZP has always been part of that. So we do a point of care diagnostic platform, which I will demonstrate, and we also do a wearables platform as well. So I say here demos, it's just to remind me to kind of show you what our technology stack at Zimmer Peacock actually looks like. So let me just go, and I know this afternoon when we talk about wearables, people are often thinking about not just medical applications, but also wellness as well, health and wellness. So linked to health and wellness, though it's not necessarily a health drink, but we've got an energy drink here called Red Bull. But just bear with me, because this is a way I can demonstrate to you our technology stack. So at Zimmer Peacock, we've developed many analytes and many technologies over the years. This is one of our technology stacks. This is way of actually doing point of care diagnostics. I sort of waved this around earlier on. You'll see these kind of electrodes come back into this conversation in a bit when I talk about sweat sensors. But you can see that we're able to manufacture at scale and using technologies that can scale to low price. I'm going to take it'll make you slightly smile, a caffeine sensor here. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to prepare a sample, a real world sample, not buffers or anything like that. I'm going to create a real world sample, a little bit of Red Bull, a little bit of diluent, which I'll put together, and I'll give that a little shake, which I've done now. I'm going to take well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually grab my smartphone here, my Samsung Android. So I have an app here. Now this app is really quite cool, actually. So what I'll do is I'm just going to scan another QR code on here. I just scanned testosterone just to kind of show you that I'm actually able to move between different analytes just by scanning QR codes. So I've just gone into glucose, for example. But what I want to do is I actually just want to go into what I do have here is a caffeine sample because I actually have some Red Bull. So I'll just scan caffeine. So I've got my app. My app says device connected. So I'm actually in Bluetooth connection with this particular Sensei or platform. I'm just going to give this a name. So I'm just going to put the word Red Bull in here. Red Bull. I'll just give it the number 1 so I can find it. That's all done. So what I'm going to do now is demonstrate another thing about electrochemistry, which makes it such a strong science. It was probably a little bit evident when I did that blood test earlier on, but electrochemistry does not need much sample, which really helps when you're actually trying to make a wearable biosensor. It's actually quite hard to get people to sweat, and it's actually quite so people don't sweat quite as much as people would otherwise believe, and so you have to have technologies that can work with low volumes. And it's the same that if you put a sensor into the body, especially interstitial fluid, you can't really expect to have that much volume. So you need technologies and sciences that will actually work with low volumes, and electrochemistry is one of those sciences. That drop I just put on there was 50 microliters. But just understand that the glucose strip I used earlier on was actually 300 nanoliters, which is 2 orders of magnitude less than the 50 microliter drop that I've got here now. So what I'm doing now is also demonstrating something else that electrochemistry is quite good at, which is actually fast assays. Now at ZP, we always try to make our assays fast anyway. This is like a perfect answer. So I did all that as a live demonstration. I've got milligrams per gram of caffeine in Red Bull is 0.315 milligrams per gram, which is actually 0.03%. So it's absolutely perfect because that's exactly what they have. Now, the reason I've done that is because it demonstrates several factors of ZP. First of all, ability to make sensors. Number 2, ability to make electronics. Ability number 3, capability of making apps and Bluetooth connection between the device. But it also says something else on my phone at the moment as well. It says upload complete. So I just want to show you what that upload complete actually means. In fact, here we go. So I'll share my screen with you here. And I'm just going to do, so upload complete means that it actually went to a cloud system called Julie. So I'm sharing that now, and I'll just do a quick refresh on here, and it will bring up my most recent assay, which was Red Bull, if I remember if I called it. So there it goes, Red Bull 1. And now now you can see that actually upload complete means it actually sent the data to the cloud. So I have real electrochemistry data in the cloud. We've got a very powerful cloud technology that brings in the raw signal, processes the raw signal, measures the signal intensity in this particular case, and turns it into milligrams per gram. And ZP has a complete technology stack. We even have an API built into this as well, so we can send the data on its way. So I just want to sort of say sensor, electronics, smartphone application, and cloud as well. And actually, so everything I just did and sent the data to the cloud as well. So that was a sort of demonstration that I wanted to do, and I'll just go forward a little bit. So we have this. I put the sensor in it. I put the drop onto the sensor. I use a QR code to tell our electronics what to do. So if somebody comes to us and says, I want to do ketones, there'll be a QR code for ketones. If one for glucose, one for lactate, one for sodium, one for potassium. The kind of analytes that people would be interested in. That was a nice, simple, safe one, which is caffeine. but you can see, I think you can see the power of electrochemistry. People keep reinventing modalities of test, surface plasma resonance, opticals, optical spectroscopy, which has been around forever, but there's always new modalities coming out, quartz crystal microbalances. There's all sorts of modalities always turning up. But unfortunately, there's something that works really well. It's been around, or at least commercially been used for glucose sensing for 40 years, and it's called electrochemistry. So I think if you're serious about actually getting to market, you want to reduce those risks. And so opening up new modalities and new science is it's kind of increasing the risk. And electrochemistry is a robust science. It can be used with real world products. We sent the data to the cloud. We actually processed the data in the cloud and actually sent the result back. So even though you saw the result on my phone, it was actually being processed in the cloud, and then we sent it back to the phone. So it's quite a sort of technology stack. Now, what we're busy doing now, and what we have done, is actually taken all that technology and shrunk it down to something much smaller. Again, electrochemistry is a very good science. When you want to make something small, like when Abbott wanted to make a small wearable continuous glucose monitor, or when BioLink, which is doing microneedles in California, they're all able to come up with these kind of form factors because they're basically using electrochemistry, and electrochemistry can be low power in terms of its modality. The biggest drain on power when it comes to wearable biosensors is actually the transmission of data. It's not the gathering of data, which I don't think you can say for photons. When you're trying to generate photons and count photons, that can be more power intensive than when you try to generate voltage and measure current. So we've built a new platform. Again, this is that idea that how do we go from an idea to something quite tangible quite quickly? And so we've built this, it's actually a potentiostat. It's a fully functioning potentiostat, because if somebody comes to us and says, I want to do glucose, then there'll be a certain potential and a certain current required. If they say ketones, it'll be a different potential and it'll have a different current. If it's lactate, it could be the same as the glucose, or both for glucose and lactate, we have what's called generation 1 and generation 2 sensors. If somebody comes for potassium, it's going to be open circuit potentiometry. But we have a set of electronics that's actually really flexible and doesn't essentially mind what the modality is. As long as the sensor is fundamentally electrochemical, then we can make it do glucose, or we can make it do potassium just by using a QR code. And this is kind of data where we've actually been live tracking some glucose data in the lab, 5 millimolar, 10 millimolar, 50 millimolar, 20 millimolar, and just streaming it up to the cloud. So many startups, when they talk about their kind of technology stack, what they're describing is this. And what ZP is doing is saying, okay, so Abbott and Dexcom each had spent $1 billion getting to market with SCGM. Today's companies, if they partner with Zimmer Peacock, it won't be for free, but they can, get to the market at a much lower cost than has historically been there, because we've put all the stepping stones and all the technologies in place. And I'll talk a bit more about some of the form factors in a minute, but here I'm just showing an image of actually a transdermal sensor in the arm, effectively. So I have mentioned that technology stack that we have different QR codes, which mean that we can do amperometric, open circuit potentiometry, impedance spectroscopy, linear sweep, cyclic, square wave voltammetry. Some of these some people want to do immunoassays. Immunoassays in a wearable format are really quite tough. Some people want to do API, active pharmaceutical ingredient testing. So things like techniques like linear sweep, cyclic, and square wave voltammetry can be useful then. Not to say that those are easy applications. And then because we have that data pipe, we're actually able to go from amperometry to glucose readings, or from amperometry to lactate readings, or from open circuit potentiometry to pH, for example. So it's the data pipe that we have in the cloud that will convert raw signal into meaningful information really quite quickly, and prevent this reinvention of the wheel, that every time somebody starts a company, they just, rather than going to MVP really quickly, they just reinvent. And I think with the in the tech industry, they get it. They're always bolting together each other's services to build an MVP, try and get 100 user feedback. But in the world of sensing and biosensing, people put unnecessary barriers in their way, because the technology that they want actually exists and reside in companies like Zimmer and Peacock. we find that the technologies that are, or the sensors that are most of interest at this moment are things like the glucose sensor. So ZP has lots of form factors for glucose sensors, the lactate sensors. These are not all of the sensors we have, but these are the ones I feel are relevant to wearables. The ketone sensor, the potassium sensor. There's some people interested in pH. I'm particularly interested in pH because I think it's very good for smart bandages, smart wound care. I think there's a really, unmet need for smart wound care at the moment, and I think that there will be wearable smart wound care technologies coming, and I'll bet it's going to be a pH sensor that's in that technology. There is a technology in the US for wearing and measuring chloride on the skin for cystic fibrosis. Before everyone jumps on and starts doing a cystic fibrosis sensor using chloride, just understand that cystic fibrosis is obviously I don't want to say devastating disease, but it is, a very unpleasant disease. But there's not actually that many people with cystic fibrosis, and the amount of chloride monitoring they really need is quite small. So be careful about building a model around cystic fibrosis. But we can also do chloride sensors. Sodium sensors are something we do. We get a lot of people asking about sodium sensors for hydration monitoring. It's probably worth saying, I think some of the kind of areas of continuous or applications for continuous wearable biosensors, diabetes, clearly, it's already been proven. Lactate monitoring for athletes, maybe lactate monitoring for sepsis, hydration monitoring, whether it's conductivity, sodium, potassium. This is a kind of keen thing, a big thing. And I also think that there's a bit of a market for the idea of monitoring dialysis patients. Now, whether you do that through a wearable or you do it through a sort of point of care diagnostic, but there is a large dialysis population. Their care pathway at the moment is just calendar based, and it could really be based on actually monitoring those patients in a more intelligent manner. I did mention the word configuration earlier on. So if we consider the skin, we've got the outer layer, we've got the dermis, and then we've got the subcutaneous tissue. Most of the interesting things that we want to monitor are kind of down in the subcutaneous tissue. So when we look at Abbott, Dexcom, and Medtronic with their CGM, they're using those kind of, I think Abbott in particular call it a filament. I sometimes call it a wire, but I can understand that the term wire might be a little bit less acceptable to a patient. So they have these filaments that go down into the subcutaneous tissue. At ZP, we also have quite a lot of IP around microneedles. So I'll bring this watch up again later on, so you'll see this. But this is a watch. This sports one is even nicer. That was originally developed by a company called PK Vitality. Now, Zimmer and Peacock were always the biosensor crew for PK Vitality when it came to biosensors. Now, PK Vitality, I mean, they had a good vision and they had a good CEO. They were just really the wrong time when it was coming to COVID. And also trying to raise money from Paris for biosensors was quite tough. So in the end, they didn't make it. But when they went into Chapter 11, ZP bought all the IP. So we do actually have a patent portfolio that we are keen to license into well-funded clients for doing continuous glucose monitoring, for example, using microneedles. But we've also done ketones and lactate on microneedles as well. None of these images are renders. These are all real things that ZP has built. We've also done some non-invasive work, and you'll see if by using sensors more like this, more like 2D sensors to measure analytes in sweat. And we've also done, in fact, we're probably most experienced actually, ironically, on implanted. Certainly not in human, but I will give you some examples of implanted sensors from ZP as well. The first kind of non-invasive that we actually ever did was actually this image was taken in 2019. So today is what is it? It's the 5th of March 2025. So this is almost 6 years old, this photo. And the electronics, we actually had a lactate sensor on there. We had Bluetooth connection. I don't know if anyone remembers these were laptops. These were around before smartphones were around. But in some ways, it dates the image because nowadays we would just be going straight to either straight to a smartphone or something like that. Now, what we were doing in that particular effort was actually monitoring the sweat And when the person was straining, we were actually able to get a lactate signal off them. We still we're still active today and actually doing microfluidics on people in order to pick up the sweat, bring the sweat onto the sensor, and get a kind of get a signal for analytes in the sweat. It's by no means trivial actually collecting sweat. Everyone, especially in academia, I'm going to collect sweat. Have you ever tried collecting sweat? It's quite painful. But just to say, at ZP, we do lab work and on people work around the idea of collecting sweat. In fact, here we are. Here's a willing volunteer undergoing some trials where we've got a sweat sensor on them, and we're trying to collect and analyze the sweat there. The nice thing about ZP is we have quite a lot of form factors. So in fact, this is more like a transdermal sensor. What we've done here is we've used a needle to essentially break the skin, and we've actually put in this particular case, a lactate sensor underneath the skin. So we're actually able to monitor the same analyte, but in two different form factors on the same person. So you can understand how powerful that is. Because when you're trying to scope out, the idea, am I going to monitor lactate here or glucose here? Or am I going to monitor glucose here or lactate here? Or same for ketones. We can actually scope that out on one person, and because it reduces the variables. Because if they've got a certain amount of glucose, we can take a glucose reading on them anyway. Same for lactate, and start saying, okay, the sensor's following the blood glucose, the blood lactate, or the sweat is following the blood glucose or the blood lactate, and start answering questions like, if my blood glucose is this, what's my sweat glucose? So we do. I mean, a nice thing about this particular image is you can see that we've got something like 4 sensors in situ on this particular willing volunteer. So we're keen not just to be making decisions on one sensor. We try to kind of get as much data as possible so we can make smarter decisions. We're really good at fabricating sensors. So I keep waving this sheet around. And this sheet is really an electrochemical cell. Has what we call a work-in, a counter, and a reference electrode on it, and it looks very different to what I'm showing you in this image here. But this is also an electrochemical cell. This is just one that, if you're familiar with something like a Dexcom sensor or a Medtronic sensor or an Abbott sensor, then this has much more it's much more akin to that. And I'm just showing the images here because these are not R&D pieces. These are really magnified up here. We really have to take a special control on making sure that we're controlling these pieces, because variability in these pieces will end up in variability in the signal, and it makes it harder to actually make a product from these kind of things. So at ZP, we've put a lot of effort into transdermal wire sensors. So we do have a lot of experience. This is something that we actually we started developing about 5 years ago. There's a couple of batteries in there, so you can get a sense of, or coin batteries, I should say, coin cells rather. That object there is 38 millimeters long. I think that's about 1.5 inches, about 3/4 of an inch in diameter. And it sounds like a joke, but this fish is not dead. This fish is anesthetized, and we're actually implanting the sensor into the fish. And these are the fish post implantation. They've been sutured back up. They're swimming around, having their glucose continuously monitored. And this is data from those fish. The fish here are a little bit, the first half are a bit hungry, then they're fed, and then the glucose goes up. So what an engineering challenge, what robust technology to be able to monitor glucose in the fish. And you can appreciate we're not sending the data by Bluetooth, because seawater is not the world's best media for sending electromagnetic based signals. We're actually using acoustics to send the data out in that particular application. Now that's not where we stopped. We're now broadening out, and we're also implanting into pigs. These pigs are not undergoing a transdermal glucose monitoring. The entire package is actually put inside the pig. So I said earlier on, that Sensionics have done an implantable sensor. And I think probably the only other people who have sort of done it in any kind of serious manner is Zimmer and Peacock. We've done it in pigs, and we've also done it in fish. And as you can see, we're also doing it on skin and also transdermally as well, and on human beings. And that's a good thing about working with Zimmer Peacock, is because we understand our technology and we're able to do our risk assessment. And because several of us are directors. We're able to do things that you couldn't normally get done by a company because it's not ethical to make people who are employees of a company necessarily participate in what's fundamentally a scientific experiment, but you can actually do that when you're a founder of a company. So here we're helping a client understand sensors and the best place to place sensors, and we are able to do human studies much faster than would normally be if people were everyone's an employee. That would be quite a hard thing to do. But we've been taking all our know-how, shrinking it down into these new sets of electronics so that we can actually take people to the market much quicker. This is not our first rodeo when it comes to wearables. I mentioned PK Vitality earlier on. They were trying to do this in a watch format. I'll just change cameras just for really quickly, just to kind of show you. Yeah, and I'll stop sharing there. But they were making these kind of watch formats. They have microneedles, which were patterned with enzymes, and then they have all the electronics in the watch itself. So the founder was very specific, or very, focused on the idea of a kind of consumer type product. And his argument at that time was that actually to make it acceptable, he wanted to put it into a watch format. I actually think it's not, because of all the marketing that Abbott's done, especially around athletes, that wearing a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, is not frowned upon. I see plenty of people walking around parks who are perfectly fit and healthy who are now wearing these as kind of health trackers, let's say. But anyway, the idea at that time was to make a microneedle system. They put a lot of IP around it, and as I say, ZP actually ended up when they went into liquidation, ZP ended up, because we understood the technology, we understood its strengths and weaknesses. Of course, it was an easier decision for us to actually go ahead and purchase that IP. If I was to summarize it, wearables for me started probably about easily 15 years ago with CGM. At the moment, there's a lot of people jumping into CGM, specifically CGM or continuous glucose monitoring for monitoring type 1 and type 2 diabetics. I still think there's a lot of space actually monitoring glucose just for health. But if you're going to monitor glucose for health, it might as well be ketones as well. I think there's a lot of interest in lactate monitoring, especially in the sports applications. I think the reason that Abbott haven't done it so far is they're probably just so busy actually just taking care of the diabetics, but it's something that we're interested in. We definitely have a technology stack that can take sample to cloud really quickly. We have a lot of experience in different form factors, from transdermal, microneedles, non-invasive sweat monitoring, and implantables as well. Though implantables in humans, I think I'll rather back off from that for a bit. I mean, that's a long Senseonics, by the way. I've been tracking that company for 15 years, and I'm pretty sure that they were 5 years old by the time I tracked them. So 20 years, I would suggest they've been working on this. But we do have a lot of experience in wearables and microneedles as well. So with that, it's just coming up to evening time in the UK. I have to take a 7-year-old to soccer practice, but I just want to say that if you do have any questions, I'll drop you a copy of this recording later on. But if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Okay, thanks very much.